Hello, and welcome to our session, Implementing Folio ERM, Practical Solutions and the Power of Partnership. We'd like to take a moment to introduce ourselves. I'm Jill Bright, the Head of Electronic Resources at St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri.
And I'm Zorian Sosik, a Folio Implementation Consultant at EBSCO Information Services, located in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Our project began in late 2023 when SLU partnered with EBSCO to implement Folio ERM as a standalone system. This was the best option for us, given our staffing and our e-resources practices at the time, though it was a bit of a leap because ideally we would have liked to implement an ERM that was integrated into our ILS, which at the time was Sierra. But we were on a timeline where we knew we needed to migrate out of Sierra in 3 to 5 years. So it wasn't really an option for us to put all of our data into Sierra, knowing we would definitely take it out in a short period of time. So we were really just in a spot where we needed to identify which ERM would work best for us. And I'll go into the details of how we did that later, but we ended up partnering with EBSCO to take on an ERM implementation process that really helped us to identify what our priorities were with our e-resources collection. And that partnership helped us develop a system to help us much better manage our e-resources collection. Some additional context into SLU libraries. We have 4 libraries: the Pius Library, Medical, Law, and a library on our Madrid campus. The focus of our ERM project with our implementation was on the collections of the Pius and Medical libraries, since we share a budget. The Law and Madrid libraries manage their own resources, and though we do share access to a lot of resources with them, we weren't creating records for most of their resources. We have an FTE of about 14,000 people, and our e-collection sizes are here. We've got 481 A to Z entries, about 10,000 ebooks, and 165,000 e-journals. Some additional context that's good to know here too is that in late 2023, the Pius and the Medical Library were in the midst of a lot of change. We were in a reorganization. We just had new leadership come in, and we were starting a new strategic plan. So it was a lot of shifting around how the libraries were being managed and how we were managing the resources within it. Our staffing history also played a role in how we approached this project. Our previous e-resources librarian retired in 2016, and the library wasn't able to replace that position for 3 years. So from 2016 to 2019, we didn't have dedicated e-resources staff. I'm sure, as you all know, that doesn't mean that the work disappears, and all of the e-resources tasks were distributed around the library. And so we had different staff members maintaining the e-resources in addition to their regular jobs. You can imagine that leaves the library in a place where it can't keep up with best practices in an area of the collection that's really growing at the same time. Fortunately, in 2020, the library was able to bring in a new resources librarian, but even that was a 50% position in the reference department. So I came in a split position, really just focusing on e-resources access, and our acquisitions was all being done in our collections department. Fast forward to last year and today, with our reorganization, the e-resources unit is now in the collections department, and we have a full-time staff of 3 people dedicated to managing our access and our acquisitions together. And that shift happened right before our implementation project. So that was the place where we're in at the beginning. A snapshot of our e-resources management before implementation. This list actually looks very nice to me. I feel like I could have worked with this if I had this list in front of me, but it didn't feel this way in practice. So we had a lot of information, but none of these systems were linked. So we had a lot of spreadsheets, including some things masquerading as spreadsheets, like our admin login documentation, which was a Word document that was 52 pages long with a table. So it was that kind of data management happening at the time. We had our A to Z list, which were very data rich. We had our knowledge base that was in Serial Solutions at the time. In Sierra, we had our order records with all of our financial information for our acquisitions, and we still have that information maintained there today. It's been very well maintained over the years, so we rely on that a lot. We had our paper copies, our filing cabinets with invoices, binders full of licenses. Probably the moment I knew we really needed an ERM system was when I created a folder on our shared drive called ERM info and basically tried to make it there. It was not successful. And finally, we had information in the place that's just the thing that keeps all e-resources librarians awake at night is that we had a lot of our information in emails. So as you can imagine, there were a lot of problems that resulted from this. As we were troubleshooting, as we were making acquisitions decisions, we were spending a lot of our time just trying to answer some really basic questions about our collections. It's stressful for the staff, kind of at this low level of always asking, what do we have? Why do we have it? It's a little stressful for the administration. Since most of the budget we spend on e-resources, knowing that there were challenges in managing that. And so it also creates challenges for succession planning. What happens if your e-resources librarian leaves, like ours did in 2016? We also had another retirement that year from our collections department, and we lost a lot of institutional knowledge. So from that perspective, we were able to identify our priorities for implementing an e-resources system and develop an understanding of what we wanted the system to do for us. We wanted to know what we have. So we wanted a well-organized, centralized system where we could retrieve data about our e-resources. And then that would allow us to be more efficient with our troubleshooting, track our renewals in a more effective manner, set up a collection assessment process, and track our perpetual access, which is a challenging task on the best of days, and even more challenging when we don't have a centralized place to track it. So our process of choosing an ERM centered around what I mentioned earlier, that we knew we were going to migrate out of Sierra as our ILS in 3 to 5 years. So that took the Sierra ERM module off the table for us. We knew we needed vendor support. After our reorganization, we were a very new team. We were bringing together our workflows and our processes. So having that outside support would have really been helpful. In addition, we were short-staffed. We didn't have a systems librarian who would have been very helpful to have on an in-house implementation. So we knew we needed vendor support. So that made an option like Coral not an option for us. We were looking for something that we could integrate our current systems in. We were migrating to EBSCO Holdings Management and Usage Consolidation, and both of those integrate with Folio ERM. And finally, we just wanted a system that was flexible to meet our evolving workflows and something that was modern that we knew would get continual support from the vendor. So based on all of that, we decided that EBSCO Folio met our needs the best.
Yes, and so SLU chose EBSCO, and that's where I come in. I was the project manager for this project on the EBSCO side, and the project is our Folio implementation projects are partnerships with the library. As Jill mentioned, they have had a long journey in their ERM processes up to this point, and I stepped in and began meeting with them, consulting. The value of the vendor side of this, Jill hinted at it, but we do a lot of the heavy lifting. There is data involved here. It's not, a whole hundreds of thousands of bib records, but it is a lot of data. And as you saw, there's lots of spreadsheets involved. So a lot of this is kind of combing through the data that is available, picking and choosing which ones, we're giving recommendations on that, and then putting that data in to Folio a certain way so that ERM questions can be answered. ERM kind of information can be answered. In addition to that, we're hosting the SaaS software at Folio as a SaaS hosted. It's not on premises. Folio goes through version upgrades. It goes through 2 to 3 version upgrades a year. So EBSCO handles that for the library. And we also, provide support in general. If the data is deleted accidentally, or if Folio goes down for whatever reason, we're there to get it back up and running as soon as possible.
One experience we had here with support following updates is that we had implemented a supplementary property called content type during our implementation process. And in a later version of Folio, that content type came out as a standardized field. So we reached out to EBSCO and asked if they could help us migrate the data from our supplementary property and match the values in the content type field. And with some back and forth, they found that they were able to do that for us, which saved us many, many hours of deleting data and retagging agreement records in Folio.
All right, so before we dive into the kind of details of SLU's implementation, just kind of giving a broad-based definition of what is in Folio. So Folio ERM in particular. So Folio is a larger full-fledged ILS with cataloging and circulation modules, but with this flavor of Folio, we are just focusing on the ERM aspect. So we have the organizations app, which is really an app that allows you to have vendor records that store contact information, addresses, administrative logins and passwords, etc. We have the agreements app, which is the app that tracks your entitlements. So what you are entitled to have based on a license agreement that you've signed. So the agreements app is kind of the meat of the app, and we'll get into that in a later part of the presentation. Well, the licenses app is pretty self-explanatory. It's where it's a license record, a representation of a license you've signed. In licenses, we mean the legal document that defines things like terms of use, authorized users, perpetual access, can you interlibrary loan something or not, etc. We have the eHoldings app. The eHoldings app is a little bit different than the other apps. It is a front end in Folio for EBSCO's holdings management or HLM knowledge base. So eHoldings allows you to see and to select and deselect packages and titles in the EBSCO knowledge base and connect them to the kind of more metadata-esque apps that we mentioned before. The last two apps here, settings is pretty self-explanatory. It's how you kind of configure the backend for a lot of these apps. And then the dashboard app is kind of a app that complements agreements and licenses in that it allows you to kind of set up queries and have them show live information from those search queries. So for instance, if you wanted to see what subset of agreements fulfill a certain criteria and have that list be dynamic and continuously available, the dashboard app is where that would happen. So talking about bringing it all together, the first couple of sessions, we talked a lot about where they're at, where they had been, where they're at, and where they wanted to go in terms of ERM. And an important part of that conversation is what are the data sources? Jill mentioned the data sources. I will reiterate, they had an existing knowledge base. So it's not quite an ERMS, but it is very similar. It stores similar amounts of information. That could have been a potential source. All the spreadsheets that Jill mentioned also can serve as sources, and they're for various things like acquisitions, tracking vendors, stuff like that. And then in addition, there are title lists from vendors that provide services of content to the library, specifically EBSCOnet and Harasowitz. They're both subscription agents that provide, for a small fee, the ability to kind of manage subscriptions to various individual journals from a lot of different publishers. And SLU has journals from both of those. So we thought those could be a source of entitlements to feed Folio ERM. And then the tools that we use or were available to use for this process of kind of combing and analyzing and combining this data. Most of this took place in Excel, utilizing a variety of Excel features such as VLOOKUPs, deduplication for data normalization, pivot tables, and that was for more like processing the data to get it in. But to get the data into Folio itself, I myself used shell scripts that were written to upload using the APIs that Folio has available data into Folio. There's a link if you wanted to check to see all the scripts that I use, and lots of other ones for Folio are at that. So we're going to kind of, the next stage of this presentation, we're going to kind of go through each app one by one and talk about what we did, the partnership aspect of it, and then kind of the actual, what ended up being implemented. So we're going to start with organizations, organizations being the vendor app, looking at what SLU had. They had a lot of vendor data, actually, including some in Sierra. We combined this data, and so we ended up choosing to use their spreadsheets and not data they had in other places because it was actually very, very full of data and was actually didn't require that much manipulation to put into Folio. Um, but we wanted to put them in. You can't just put information into Folio and expect it to be completely useful and coherent at the end of the project. We want to put it in a certain way, with a certain structure and mapping that fulfills the needs of the library. So we did that. An example of that is we created in Folio, you can assign categories or types to vendors. So you could say a vendor is a subscription agent, or a vendor is a consortium, or a vendor is a library software provider. So we defined those, and in particular, it will show on the next slide. We put these down with the thought of how the library would use the organization's app and its filters to search for specific vendors.
So two of the vendor types that we customized kind of outside the standard types were SLU subscription partner and usage reports email to vendor. The SLU subscription partner vendor type, we wanted to attach to our organization records that we could then attach to agreement records to indicate where maybe a campus department or the law or Madrid library helped pay for the subscription, or maybe had more other kind of input into why we subscribe to an item. The other custom vendor type that we came up with was usage reports email the vendor. And that, let me show you how that worked for us on the next slide here. So here we are in the organizations app. And on the left-hand side, I've filtered the organizations by type to the usage report vendor type. And on the right, it gives me a list of all the vendors that we need to email for usage data, either annually or as needed. And what this allowed us to do, one of our priorities for the ERM was to centralize our data. This allowed us to get rid of the spreadsheet that we keep that keeps this list of vendors that we need to email. So it really centralized and increased our efficiency. And in our implementation, following our organization setup, we moved into agreements. The organizations app is fairly straightforward. For lack of a better term, the data in there is really a lot like a Rolodex. The agreements app is more data heavy, and we spent a lot more time with the implementation piece here. And this is what the agreements app looks like when you open it up in Folio. On the left, you have a search box, and you can perform a faceted search on your agreement records. So you can limit them to certain organizations, what status they are. And on the right, it lists your agreement records for you, and you can click and open one. Here, for example, is our agreement record for Wall Street Journal, and you can see where you can enter all of the information. Up at the top, it's got the start and end dates for the subscription, the title of the agreement, and in the description, this is a free text box that is searchable. So you can kind of put in here whatever you want. We developed some standardized terms for it. There's the content type field you can see there that I mentioned earlier. And down below is the period note and tracking for the subscription. This is just the top portion of the agreement record. Down below here are linked licenses, linked organizations, and documents that you can link on the agreement record.
So as Jill said, the agreements app is data heavy, and you can put a lot of data if you want into the agreements app. But once again, we don't want to just put any data or all data in the agreements app because without any sort of intention, because then it won't be very useful. So we spent a lot of time talking about the various sources that we could use for this. We thought about using the Zero Solutions package list. We looked at using their recently converted HLM list. We looked at their internal lists, some of the same lists that we used for the organizations. Acquisitions list, so a list of, a spreadsheet that's primarily used to know what things are coming up for renewal and when to pay and what to pay and who to pay, as well as that, the A to Z, the SpringShare A to Z database list that has a fair amount of resources on it that the library has. So we ended up using a combination of the internal spreadsheets, those title lists from EBSCO.NET and Harasowitz, and then the internal database list. And we combined that data so it was all uniform, so it could go into Folio, which took some spreadsheet work and some analysis work. But even with all this data, we even with it normalized, if you will, we still needed to kind of figure out which fields we really wanted to pull from that data and put into Folio, into the agreements record in specific places that would be the most useful. So one of these aspects is you have a lot of flexibility with the agreement record in Folio. You can have a package be one agreement, and you can have agreement line, or like agreement line similar to like a purchase order line. It's kind of an itemized list of things underneath that larger agreement. So you could have a one-to-one kind of relationship between agreements and agreement lines where you have a package as an agreement, and then you have that corresponding package in e-holdings attached as an agreement line. Or, as is common, you may have a series of EBSCO databases, including Academic Search Premier, that you get as a quote-unquote like mega package of databases. And they're all on the same invoice. They're all the same renewal dates. None of them have perpetual access. You could choose to put, instead of making one agreement for each one of those, you could group them all into one agreement, call it EBSCO package, A, and input the information that you need to start and end dates, the renewal cycle, that it's not perpetual access. And then you could link at the databases would be broken out at the agreement line level. That's kind of the granularity we are faced with, in deciding when and where to do one or the other took up a lot of this process, right? And we kind of came up with, after a lot of talking about this with SLU, we came up with kind of a guidance for how we would proceed. So anything that has a unique title, whether it's at the title level or package, has unique renewal dates and needs perpetual access tracked, i.e. it has perpetual access, those things would get their own agreements. And so this primarily affected how we parsed the EBSCO.NET title list, because the EBSCO.NET title list of journals has hundreds of journals in their case. And several of them were from the same vendor, had the same dates, but they were different titles. And so we used this to kind of group those as needed, but for the most part, we kept those titles separate because they wanted to track the perpetual access. And it's a balance of how much granular information you want at the title level versus how many agreements you want to manage. Because every year when you renew a package, you have to go into the agreement and make a new start and end period dates. So we did that. We kind of coalesced all that data, as I mentioned, and we have data templates that we give our clients. We used one for agreements, which allows us to look at the data before it goes into Folio, instead of putting it into Folio, seeing how it looks, and then having to take it back out. We took this kind of outside the system iterative approach. And we went through several rounds of that. I think it took us several weeks to settle, even once we had decided on what data to go in, to revise that and get it the way that SLU wanted before we put it in.
Once we had that data in place, the Folio went to work for us pretty early on after that. The most exciting thing for me personally and the work that I was doing was being able to use the status limiter in agreements. Limiting items to in negotiation allowed us to track, to see what was in renewal currently. Previously, we just kind of had all that tracking in email, and it was a challenge to track. So this was really exciting. What we did after implementation was customize the label on 2 of these status items over here on the left. So in negotiation was out of the box. We customized one of the labels to say pending invoice or payment, and another one to say in review. So this way we were able to capture our renewals workflow with these statuses. So things go from in review to in negotiation, and then finally pending invoices. And part of the reason we use that pending invoice or payment status is that since we only implemented the ERM modules in Folio, we didn't use the invoices app. There's functionality there for tracking invoices. But since we're doing it all here in ERM, we made some flexible customizations here that have really helped us out. Another piece of our renewal tracking that we're doing at a more granular level is using the period note in the agreement record under agreement period. So we're tracking a few items in here, just typing them in as we go through the process of renewal. We've got the status, the price, the percent increase, and also the Sierra order record. Since we can't directly link between the 2 systems, having the order record in there makes it easier for us to pop over to Sierra and get all our financial history for an agreement. So the status here we use to indicate just where it is in the renewal process, whether it's pending the license, pending a response from the vendor, or anything like that.
One thing to note about the agreements app, and I mentioned the dashboard app could be used with agreements. This tracking the details of the start and end dates in Folio is really, really important for this particular extra, I don't want to say extra functionality, but additional functionality. So if you have the end date in all of your agreements, you can use the dashboard app to set a search for all agreements that have an end date that's coming up in the next 30 days. And it kind of is a continuously moving list. Whether that current date is today in May or 6 months from now in August, you would see what's coming up for renewal and not stuff that was renewed a year ago or whatever. So this is really nice. And you can set it to be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever days you want it to be. But it's using the data, the kind of rich data that we put into the agreement records to essentially provide a list for the library to know what's coming up and what they needed to initiate the processes for. This was kind of an idea that we came up with together, and since then I've recommended this to many, many libraries, and it's been well received. So it's one of the best parts about Folio ERM and why it's worth it to really think about all the data you put into the agreements record. And then I had mentioned tracking perpetual access. Perpetual access tracking, as in a lot of ERM projects, it's a what I like to call perpetual project. It's never fully complete. It's always done in starts and stops. Kind of, it's a important project that in my experience, having done work, ERM work, it doesn't always get done fully. So how do we use Folio, and in particular the Folio agreements, to track this? As Jill kind of noted, we chose to put perpetual access in the description field. As far as knowing having a source of data that indicated what had perpetual access or not, we used, there is a report we can run for SLU from EBSCO that shows that information to some extent. So we kind of added that information into the mix and added it in. And in the agreement record, there's several places you can track this. So if it does have perpetual access, there is something in the top of the agreement record, a field that says is perpetual, and it's either yes or no. I think you can leave it blank, but we're only concerned with having it be yes. But that in and of itself is not totally useful. You really want to know, if you have perpetual access, what years you are entitled to that perpetual access. And that is where we pull the data from the EBSCO report and put it in a description field. Another place to put this is in the agreement line, especially if you have kind of the granularity level you have for agreement is something like Sage journals. You have a bunch of Sage journals, and you want to look at see the perpetual access information per Sage journal. If you have all those attached as agreement lines, you can add that information into the notes field in the agreement line, that agreement subrecord, which allows it to be tracked at another kind of granular level.
So another way we're tracking our perpetual access is when a journal subscription agreement closes and we have perpetual access to those items, we create a separate agreement record, usually by duplicating the original and then editing. But we create a separate agreement record just for the perpetual access. We put as many details in here as we can, the titles. If we have a full title list, we'll attach it to the agreement record as a supplementary document. But we get all of the date and title information in here as much as we can. And then we keep this perpetual access record active.
And so, again, illustrating how much information you can put into an agreements record in Folio, we have supplementary properties, which allows you to essentially add custom fields to Folio. And there's a lot of use cases for this, and we talked about that quite a bit with SLU. Just a few you can see, these are kind of defaults that they chose, content types. So whether if you want to be able to see all of your agreements that are ebook packages or ebook resources, you could tag all those agreements as content type equals ebook and be able to see that. And you can combine these kind of searches even more with other filters. So SLU is in Missouri and they have the consortial purchasing through Mobius. If they wanted to see all of their agreements that's from Mobius that are ebooks, you could do that with a combination of supplementary property fields. So it's very, very powerful. It takes a lot of setup and a lot of thought. So once again, we talked that through. One of the most important fields I think for them was subject, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, we have to decide which one of the default supplementary properties to use. By default they're turned off. And if you're going to make a custom one, what to use for the pick list. So do you want the fields to be controlled? Do you want it to be open text? Aspects like that.
And I can show you here a few examples of how we created those lists and what they look like. Here we have package type and authentication. For authentication, we added values like email domain. Did it use the proxy? Did it use single sign-on? We also set up the content type supplementary property, as I mentioned before, that later became a standardized field. So we're moving that one out. And we also set up subject as a supplementary property. So we can pull a list of all of the history databases, for example, and make collection decisions from that list. Another feature in the Agreements app that we've mentioned a few times here is the description field. And when we set up the perpetual access note in the description field, we were inspired to make some other standardized terms that we could put in here because it is searchable. So we decided to use some defined terms and documented them for ourselves, like multi-year agreements. So we could just search in the agreements box for multi-year agreements and get a full list. These are things that we could certainly make supplementary properties later on. And so we'll have to go back and look at that and consider.
Finally, with agreements, the last kind of bit of information, we mentioned all those spreadsheets. Some of those spreadsheets are vendor produced, and they're not going to go away. You're going to keep getting title lists from vendors as you renew resources, or you're going to get usage reports that you may want to store here. So Agreements app allows you to store documents and keep them all in one place next to the actual metadata and stuff, instead of just like on a folder somewhere on a shared drive.
Here's an example of how we're using the supplementary documents in the Agreements app. So we link to invoices, we link to our usage data, both on our shared drives, and we'll upload title lists, usually only the most recent one. And then we also will occasionally attach or link to an email here if it's like related to a vendor negotiation and we want to keep that information in front of us. It's great to get those out of our email accounts.
And then finally, we're going to talk about the licenses app in Folio and how, what we recommended for SLU. One of the things that we consider the most in terms of working with clients and licenses is what is the status of license tracking and management at the institution? We try to have an honest conversation because even more so than perpetual access license, having kind of organized licenses with terms of use extracted and ready to be put into a system is really hard to achieve in libraries currently without a system. So most libraries are coming in. That's why they're coming to Folio. They want this system to start that process. So we don't always have a ton of data to work with. I don't believe we had a lot of data to work with SLU, but records can still be created. We can create base records without really license information in them. You just know that you have a license from certain vendors. And so we can create vendors that way and then rely on this, the e-resource acquisitions lifecycle to provide opportunity to kind of populate these more in a less overwhelming project-based way.
That start small approach really worked for us at SLU because we were definitely in a position where our license information was in a lot of different places. So we picked up with our renewal cycle and started entering license agreements. And about a year out from when we started entering the license agreements, we have 16 in there. This is just kind of a sample of what it looks like in the license record. So you've got your start and end dates and your attached terms. After implementation and before we really started entering license agreements, we created a rubric of what licensing terms we wanted to track and what values we wanted to attach to those and set those up in Folio. So this is very much in process for us still, but we're in a much better position than we were. So when we're thinking about the terms that we enter for our license agreements, you can use the terms field to search your license agreements in the app. So here I'm in the licenses app, and I have limited our licenses to terms where the walk-in user is set to yes. So we had a request from our Madrid libraries. They asked, which licenses can we have walk-in users? We can provide the list from here. So going into our implementation, one of our priorities was creating a collection assessment cycle. We were pretty far out from that when we started. But here today, we're much further in and much closer to it, and using the functionality from Folio and the data we entered there to set this up for ourselves. So we're using the dashboard to look at our renewals, upcoming renewals, and pull usage and review them. In agreements, we're using supplementary properties. We've set up a supplementary property for the renewal notice month, which is basically just whatever month we get an email from the vendor, we tag the agreement record with that month. And that allows us to go back and pull a quarterly list of, say, all July through September quarterly renewals and look at those that way. And we haven't yet, but we're looking for ways to pull in the subject supplementary property here as well, if we did want to just look at all the history databases. The renewal priority set to for review, we utilize to, and that comes up in the dashboard in our list, so we can look at that and flag things that we want to come back to for a closer look in the renewal process. For items we flag as for review, we also put a renewal consideration note in the description, and we say things like if we want to look at a different platform or if the usage was trending down and we want to take a closer look there.
One thing I'll add for what Folio ERM kind of adds to this collection assessment cycle is eHoldings has further integrations with other EBSCO products, and one of those is EBSCO's usage consolidation, which is essentially a sushi server. So it's a place where counter usage can be automatically downloaded. If it's not automatically downloaded, it can be uploaded and stored. And that information displays in the eHoldings app. And that kind of, usage is one of the typical criterion folks use to analyze stuff in the kind of review aspect of the cycle. So that shows up in Folio, again, with the caveat that cost information needs to be entered into HLM as well to get the full cost per use calculation.
So here, about a year and a half out, one of the things I'm most impressed by, and I think we're most grateful for, is that we were able to get through this implementation in about 3 months. I know that's something, as a new team, a newly reorganized department, we probably would not have been able to do on our own. We've also had a big shift in how we're managing our e-resources. We've moved from this very reactive, always asking, kind of what we have and why we have it, to a very proactive management approach where we know what we have. Our troubleshooting is a lot more efficient. We're tracking our renewals. and have a real assessment cycle going. And if nothing else, we have our documentation attached to our agreement record. We're using notes. And we've got everything out of our emails, which there's a lot of things that make me lose sleep at night, but it's no longer the email situation of having all of our e-resources info there. So it's really shifted the way we work with our e-resources management. So thank you for attending our session. If you have any questions for us, you can reach us at our emails on the slide here.